Welcome again on behalf of Arena for Journalism in Europe and also on behalf of Observatorio Balcani e Caucaso, our partner organization in this mini-series of panels on data dilemmas and how we are going to deal with them. I think that most of the people I see in the audience were also here this morning, so I will not make a long introduction, but just say that we have discussed this morning the Pegasus project, and we'll now continue with a discussion on the cybersecurity strategies and what demands we should put on it as journalists in Europe and the dilemmas we face there after the cybersecurity strategy was presented in December. I'm no specialist on that. I will leave that to the panel. I am a specialist on this conference tool, so I will just remind you that if you have any technical problems, 95% of them can be solved by refreshing your browser window. So that's the first solution. If that doesn't help, you can click on my name in the panel to the left, and you can write a private message to me, and I'll try to help you. You can adjust the panels in the window as much as you want. You can minimize the presentation window and see the faces bigger, which you may want to do because there will be no PowerPoint presentations or anything today. So you can minimize the window in the on the blue square in the upper right corner of the logos you see. And what else? If you have questions, you can type them in the chat, and Łukasz and I will monitor the questions. If you have logged on with your microphone active but muted, you can also turn on your microphone and ask yourself. But if you want to do so, please advise us in the chat so we know that you have a question, and we'll pass the word to you. That being said, I'm very happy to turn the table over to Łukasz Krol, who is going to moderate today's session. He is he trains journalists in digital security and also follows all the themes that we are concentrating on in this little mini-series of seminars, like artificial intelligence, how we interact with the technological and social realities we're in, and what algorithms do to our life. And he will now introduce the panel on cybersecurity, and I will disappear into the background. Over to you, Łukasz.
Perfect. Good morning to everybody. Thank you so much, Trine. I hope that everyone's having a wonderful, incredibly caffeinated morning. Unless you're not a caffeine person in terms, then, I hope you had nice tea this morning. It's an absolute joy to see so many people already in the audience today. So why don't I start by very quickly introducing and opening the panel, because we have three absolutely wonderful panelists. It's been an absolute joy working so far to prepare and open the panel. So Carola, Laurens, and Sebastian. The way we will start is that first Carola, Laurens, and Sebastian will sort of summarize their work and summarize a couple of key points and things that they were thinking about. And then we will launch into a bit of a bigger discussion. As usual, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So please, please, please type your questions in the chat. I will be monitoring the chat. If I see something particularly exciting, I might even interrupt one of our speakers to ask the question straight away. And if you'd like to, you can also raise your hand or say that you want to say something. And you can even ask the questions via audio if you'd prefer. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And thank you so much for joining us. And without further ado, why don't we give the floor to Carola first, because you're the first one on my monitor.
Hi to all, and thank you, Łukasz, and thank you for inviting me here. And so just to briefly introduce myself, I've been a tech cyber journalist for many years, covering privacy, surveillance, and cybersecurity. In the last year, I've been working as cybersecurity awareness and engagement in some company, and now in a human rights organization. And I'm working a lot on the security of humans, of employees and people working in these organizations, and also activists. So going straight to the topic of this panel, we start from the EU cybersecurity strategy. As you know, this new cybersecurity strategy is a key component of different, of also other strategies and plans, like the Security Union strategy and the Commission Recovery Plan. And it also offers, I think, an unprecedented level of investments over the next 7 years. I think this would probably quadruple previous investments we have seen in the digital transition. So it's interesting because, of course, the EU cybersecurity strategy focuses on some sectors such as transports, energy, telecommunications, finance, but it also mentions democratic processes. However, it seems that member states that are implementing this cybersecurity strategy have some clear ideas of what means to protect transports or finance and energy sectors. When it comes to democratic processes, it is not so clear what you are supposed to do. And of course, I think it's relevant to this discourse that we talk about the right to privacy, to anonymity, which is particularly relevant to journalistic sources, of course, but also freedom of expressions and so on. For instance, if we look at the way some member states are trying to get cyber ready. For instance, in Italy now, we just created this new cybersecurity national agency that will be the main coordination point for cybersecurity. And we have this list of strategic industry or organizations that need to be defended because they offer very important services. It's interesting that this list is not public, by the way, and but we don't know much about what could be done or should be done in order to also to protect the democratic process we were talking about. And also there is like an important project of a national cloud, which is another topic that is very up in the priority of the European Union to have a sort of cloud, a sovereign cloud, where you basically try to modernize and standardize technologies, strengthen cybersecurity, and also have some sort of technological independence. So at the moment, there are a lot of things and a lot of funds that are moving in the direction of cybersecurity and cybersecurity efforts. And but I think there are some pieces that are still missing, that are the ones more connected to the rights, journalism, democracy, and defending some specific rights. So maybe we can talk more about this later in the panel. Another topic I've been following the last years, and I conclude, is the use, the selling, and the export of spywares, which is another topic that I think is quite important within the EU at the moment, because we both have member states using this technology in order to do investigations. But we also have an industry exporting these technologies abroad. And we've seen many cases of also abuses abroad, as you probably have seen in the former panel. So I would stop here by now and see later. I can't hear Łukasz.
Łukasz, we can't hear you. Oh. Łukasz will re-enter and refresh his browser window, as I said. And sorry, Laurens, if you could could continue, please.
Sure, no worries. So I'll do a quick introduction of myself while Łukasz comes back, and I think he's actually back right now.
I think I am.
Okay, great.
We hear you loud and clear.
So yeah, so just quick introduction to what I do and how I can help in this panel. So I'm Laurens Rillis. I'm a global cybersecurity correspondent at Politico Europe, the European operation of Politico, which is originally a US political news organization. And so my focus essentially is on covering European cybersecurity policy and politics. I cover the EU cybersecurity strategy very closely, and all of the little bits that come out of it, and the parts that are in negotiation right now in terms of new requirements, how the European industry is adapting to new threats, etc. For this panel, so maybe just to give you a sense of what I think is sort of the broader trend in European cybersecurity policy and how media fits into this. So I think looking at the past years, I started covering this issue in roughly 2016. And back then, the EU only had one law, which was the NIS directive, the first European law on cybersecurity. And beyond that, there was not much around, really. You know, there was an agency here and this and that. You had national governments adapting to cybersecurity gradually, but a lot of the focus at that point was on different topics. And one of the topics that was very hot back then was GDPR and data protection. And all of sort of the security discussion seemed to sort of gravitate towards data protection as a topic. But we've seen that change quite dramatically, I think, in the past years. So if a couple of years ago everything was about Snowden, data protection, and that part of digital security, now we're seeing increasingly the discussion focus on nation-state-backed hacking groups and the threat thereof, or new threats of ransomware and cyber criminals who also put pressure on the system. So I think that's been sort of the big trend, which means that right now cybersecurity is very hot at EU level, but also at national level. Everyone's very focused on this, which obviously for journalists is always fun because it means you have a lot to write about. But just two thoughts on how I think this links to the discussion we'll have today on our work and sort of, you know, how it affects democracies and national institutions and governments. So I think what's been clear is that initially the focus of the EU in its cybersecurity strategy and how it sort of rolled out cybersecurity requirements across the bloc was very much what they call sort of the internal market perspective. So focusing on the companies, the industries, the sectors, making sure that Europe's economy essentially was well protected against hacking. And throughout the years, we've seen that sort of image and that focus shift in part due to sort of incidents that showed that the threat was as much, if not more, on government institutions, on political parties, and on politics in general. So we've seen European politicians, governments, and EU officials increasingly sort of having to reckon with the fact that they are the target, and that's I think been quite interesting to see, because it means it sort of translates into a lot of frictions, because the European Union isn't necessarily very well adapted to handle this specific threat, and we can talk more about that later on. But then secondly, I think importantly, media has become an integral part of this discussion, integral part of this picture, because what we've seen is that if you look, for instance, at cyber espionage specifically, we've seen that threat actors have increasingly, instead of targeting institutions themselves, politicians themselves, which they've done for years, they've also started targeting what's essentially the ecosystem around politics. And that means that think tanks are increasingly the target of cyber attacks. Media organizations are increasingly the target of cyber attacks. And I think that's where we come into the picture. I think if we understand our jobs well, and we understand our place within the democratic system well, we also know that we're well connected, that we have information and sources that we should be protecting at all costs, and that we sit on information and on context and on essentially what could be considered, what's of interest for cyber espionage. And I don't know about other people. I'm happy to hear, but I've seen a lot of phishing attacks on, for instance, our organization, and I think this is the case for a lot of media organizations, where increasingly you see attempts at getting access to the systems, and there's been some examples across Europe from compromises. So that sort of those are two elements I just wanted to bring up, which is, one, politics has become a prime focus, and secondly, media is an integral part of that. Maybe just two more thoughts before I close off. So if we talk about European cybersecurity and EU cybersecurity, there's always a lot of friction between who has the power. And I think this is quite an interesting part to see play out. You see national governments wanting to keep control over their own institutions, their own elections, their own media to a certain extent. You see the European level trying to step up, but then a competence problem arises. So there's a lot of unsolved questions here that I think European politicians, policymakers are still working through. And then secondly, we should also not forget that Europe is not the only region in the world that faces this. If we look at the recent discussions between Europe and the US, for instance, you see that there's a lot of commonalities. There was a European response to the 2016 election hacking campaign by the Russian government, just as much as there was a US response. And we've seen sort of these trends play out across the world, across the Western world, of course. And a lot of the discussion right now is sort of about democracies versus authoritarian regimes, or to what extent Europe can have an influence in its own sphere. Does it work with the US, etc.? So I think those are also interesting questions if we look at democracy and media, because it seems the case that we're increasingly facing similar challenges. But the solutions to those are not always similar, and Europe has very their own ways of dealing with these things. I think there's quite some interesting elements there to discuss. I'll keep it at that to make sure not to talk too long, but I'm happy to come back to these points later on. Thank you.
Totally. Thank you so much. Before we dive into Sebastian, two very quick things. First of all, we all four of us kind of wanted to announce, but didn't announce yet, that we're speaking in a personal capacity, and as such, not always representing the views of our institution. Views presented are the panelists and moderators' own. And the second thing, please, ask any questions that you might have in the chat. I'm really interested to hear what all of you have to think about it. And we do, of course, have enough material for a conversation, but we'd love it to be as engaging as possible. So, hoping for a lot of comments in the chat. Sebastian?
Hello, good morning. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I hope you can hear me. Yes, looks like perfect. Thanks. So, yeah, maybe briefly to my background. So, I'm a senior researcher at Goethe University Frankfurt and also the founder of the Social Engineering Academy, which is a company, and we provide training with serious games, in particular against social engineering. And yeah, I'd like to start a bit on, let's say, how I arrived where I'm now. So I have a technical background, but if we follow, let's say, my journey, it shows a bit why this topic is so difficult and so hard to tackle, I guess. So I started with mathematics and computer science, and quite naturally, I was interested a lot in cryptography, which is basically in the intersection of both of them. And with a brief excursion to software engineering, so how to build critical systems, I noticed more and more that you cannot provide security or privacy without having a more holistic view. And then I started and somehow also considered economics, or if you put in some security measures that will cost something, and that's important in particular for companies, but also for organizations. Usually you have some kind of budget and you need to spend it on the right things, and you don't want to waste it on the wrong things. And you always have the question, so how much money should I spend on security, which is particularly hard because if let's say you do everything right, you always have the feeling nothing happens and you overspend your budget. You might spend too much unless you spend too little or in a wrong way, and then you get some security incidents. But it took not long, and then I somehow noticed you also need to deal with legal requirements, in particular covering compliance. And I think in research, it's still a very open topic whether compliance actually helps security or somehow hinders it, because people are busy with documenting things instead of having time to fix certain bugs or vulnerabilities. But on the other hand, if people are not doing security, you need to push them somehow, and they need to prove that they're doing that. But still, that's not enough. So you, Lawrence already mentioned it, you can attack the people directly. So you cannot only be in technology, so you also need some kind of user perspective, psychology, and you also need to consider the willingness of the users to adapt a certain technology. So we have lots of crypto things, but today I think still most of the email is not encrypted. And that's probably not because we do not have cryptographic algorithms, because it's more because it's somehow complicated to set all things up for an ordinary user, and you can do a lot wrong, and it's not very clear how that benefits you. So that's the next dimension. And yeah, let's say most recently, I also started to tackle a bit politics and governance. And if you see the recent development in at least Germany, I'm not so sure about the other European countries. So we had some white hat hackers, and they were contacting the companies or even the political parties and telling them, hey, here's a vulnerability in your software, you might want to fix that. And instead of being thankful for getting like some advice for free, people were just, or companies or parties were just suing those people and saying, you hacked my system and I sue you. And I mean, on the long term, that only can go wrong, because people won't, they won't give the bugs anymore to the concerned people. They will just keep it or just anonymely publish them somewhere else. So that might be very difficult if we do not consider this perspective. And right now, I was invited via panel fit, where the idea of the project is to adapt to regulatory changes, or let's say each change which is made makes a lot of work for people dealing with those changes, because they need to adapt processes and everything. But I have the feeling the project I'm more involved in, which is cybersecurity for Europe, is probably closer to the topic. And in Cybersecurity for Europe, that's one of the 4 pilots where we try actually to shape a bit the cybersecurity capabilities of Europe, and all the pilots have different approaches and try to do it in their own way. So there is also some disagreement and different approaches, but that makes it very interesting to see what at the end will come out of it. And the objectives, which you can also see as some kind of challenges for this project, is to design and test some governance structures, in particular for the cybersecurity competence network, and to research and innovate a roadmap. So just the question, where should we go in the future? What are the hot topics? I mean, we have lots of challenges with AI, with blockchain, and you have lots of buzzwords, but still it's not clear which one of them is the most important. And in particular for blockchain, you always have the discussion whether you really need it. There might be some cases where you do, but there might be other cases where it's just a nice buzzword to play around with. And other challenges of the project include to improve education and training, and that's not only for students, but also for professionals. And in particular, to reduce the fragmentation between researchers and in particular people from industry, because the idea sometimes have that researchers have nice ideas, but they're not suitable for practice, or even if they are suitable, they might not be picked up. So there's some kind of gap to bridge. And yeah, I guess that's already the end of my introduction. So it's a large project. I could tell way more about it. There are more than 40 partners involved, so I'm definitely not involved in all actions. But if you're interested in anything, I think I could at least connect you to the right people in the project dealing with certain of these topics. And there are way more challenges than I have sketched.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And first of all, Sebastian, if you've offered to connect people, could you possibly drop your contact details in the chat, just so we know how to reach you if we'd like to be connected along those lines? And
yeah, sure.
One of the things I'm just thinking about, because all of us have kind of alluded to the idea of the media and media security. And for me, one of the big issues that we face right now is disinformation, especially weaponized disinformation, right? Both from within the EU and coming from outside of the EU. So one of the things I'm kind of thinking about right now is, to what degree do you think that weaponized disinformation or the fight against disinformation should be seen under the cybersecurity umbrella and against the long-term cybersecurity strategy? Should we see, let's say, media security, not just in terms of phishing attacks against journalists, but in terms of disinformation? Should we treat it as a cybersecurity issue, or is it a completely different category? What do you think?
May I?
Yes. I was saying both you and Lawrence were so excited to speak, but you were even more excited.
So, of course, there is a connection, especially when we see operations such as hack and leaks. Of course, there is a connection, and then after the leak, creating some buzz and trying to have some interference on the public discourse, or the political climate, whatever. So of course, at that point, there is a connection in terms of really cybersecurity. And we have seen, as Lawrence was saying before, we have seen a lot of journalists and media who are targets of phishing, but also more sophisticated espionage, and even DDoS attacks, actually, sometimes. So there is a connection, but I think also that when it comes to disinformation, we should exercise some caution about just saying that it's a cybersecurity thing and having some authority, for instance, trying to be in charge of dealing with it, because it has to do with the information ecosystem. And I think that that's the level where you should work. So working on having an healthy media ecosystem in order to tackle this information. Otherwise, you just risk to have polarizing institutions trying to divide the truth from what is not truth, and I think it gets a little bit messy. And so I think you need to do a lot of work on journalism, on having an healthy journalism ecosystem, and also I know it's a long-term objective, but you should work on having some digital education for the citizenship, because there are some specific skills and abilities about decoding the digital information that you need to teach and learn. So I don't think there are very easy solutions for this. You need to do a very long-term plan to deal with this. And of course, in terms of strict cybersecurity measures, you can work a lot on the cybersecurity of media and journalists.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That's a great analysis. And also, I must add, that's an incredible background on a video call. Like, it's one of the best video call backgrounds I've seen in my life. So congratulations. Sorry, I just needed to, because I know that you started off the call from a different angle, so I just needed to flag this up, and also for the audience, for all those who haven't noticed. Lawrence, you wanted to quickly speak about disinformation and cybersecurity as well, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting element, because disinformation obviously seems to be the area that comes close to what we do in our daily lives as journalists as well. It's closest to essentially our trade and what we do. But I think there's different ways of looking at it, and I do echo Carola's point that it's complex, it's messy, and you should think a lot about how you approach it and how you handle it. From what I've seen from sort of the government perspective, let me start there. But there's some clear examples of disinformation actually being part of a cybersecurity challenge, and this is not a sort of how we decide to classify it. But let me take one example where it's actually become a concrete part of the threat, which is the recent campaigns by a threat actor called Ghostwriter, which popped up in Germany in the past year, targeted German politicians with phishing attacks, and ahead of the elections, essentially, what seemed to be attempts at doing hack and leak operations. And then in the spring, they popped up in Poland, where they actually did successful hack and leak operations, which destabilized the government quite a bit, because it involved emails from the prime minister as well. But this is a threat actor that people in the industry have linked going back to 2018, I believe, and they've been active in Latvia. They've been active in Lithuania. They've been active in different countries in the Baltics. I've looked at one of these campaigns quite closely. I think it was in Lithuania, and I'm not entirely sure about the date, but I think it's 2020. And what you see is that a threat actor like that actually uses the media ecosystem as a way to destabilize, or as a way to try and influence national politics. And in this case, it was a case of hackers impersonating journalists, also impersonating media organizations, in some cases taking over some online portals or media organizations. And then the question becomes, how do you defend yourself against that? And I think there it turns into a discussion on to what extent can you make sure that your democracies understand what's trusted and what's not, can differentiate between where information is coming from, can analyze information. that they are reading, and I think that gets to the core of what disinformation is about. It's about, you know, whether people reading it, citizens, voters, anyone that is part of society can actually differentiate between truthful, not truthful, between sort of factual and non-factual. I think that's been the challenge that we've faced in media in the past years on this discussion on disinformation. The question of whether it's a cybersecurity problem, well, from a threat perspective, it definitely is. From a resilience perspective and a defense perspective, I think it's much broader. And I think there we get into discussions of, you know, should there be a truth police, or who decides which websites are legitimate and which aren't? And obviously that brings you into a whole, you know, there the cure can be as poisonous as the poison. So I think that's sort of, that shows you the challenge that we're facing. But just to step back for just one more second is, you know, from a policy response perspective, we do see the increasing the increasing trend of governments trying to incorporate this in their cybersecurity strategies. And this is the case in the EU, but it's also the case in different European governments. And to a certain extent, that's a logical response to the fact that it's becoming part of the threat that they're seeing externally as well. It's not there.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And I think that Marius wrote a really interesting question in the chat for you, actually, Lawrence. Are the ghostwriters good? Not, of course, good people, but are they good in what they're doing? Would you consider them to be strong experts?
I'm happy to do what's called a guesstimate. But I think from what we've seen, you know, we reported on them as sort of the most brazen threat actor linked to the Russian to Russian authorities. So, you know, cybersecurity firms have linked this to Russian intelligence, GRU, or at least part of it, part of the tools that they're using. And they're very different from other threat groups in that other threat groups seems to be more stealthy in the way that they conduct their attacks. This is a group that's very open, very very sort of in your face. But in doing that, they do show, they show quality. I think from some analysts told me it's sort of it's a sophisticated mix of your sort of your traditional phishing plus, you know, sort of impersonation, social engineering, etc., and then hack and leak, and it's all of the different elements combined. But it's very in your face. Is it good? Well, depends on what the end result is. But if you look at sort of the fuzz that they've created, I think they have at least achieved some of the objectives.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you a lot, Marius, for the question. Sebastian, would you like to comment about disinformation, or can I launch another question at you?
Yeah, maybe a brief comment on how to tackle that. Lawrence already started this discussion, but I remember also Carola said it's a lot about educating and training. And I think for misinformation, if we leave out the part a bit about identity theft and taking over identities from journalists and trying to spread misinformation, I think the general public, and of course including politicians and so on, they all need to learn somehow how to check sources and see whether the information is reliable. And I still think that's something which is missing in education, in particular early at school. So to get some online literacy and see, so how do I check if the source is reliable, and how do I check facts and so on. And to some degree, I also see that it's, let's say, an economic problem, because many of the media is a lot about creating clicks and showing advertisements. So it's not so important to have real facts, but it's more important to show something which is interesting so that people click. And in some of the media, I feel like they are just collecting information kind of very fast, with the idea to be the first, and that sometimes just leads to party A is saying this, party B is saying this, without any kind of checking or any kind of judgment. Like sometimes it's kind of easy to say, okay, this person is wrong, but in the articles you see, it's just like you have party A and party B cited, and without any credibility check and so on. So I think there's a lot for what tackles like the whole way society is working, because on the other hand, if you want to do good journalism, of course you need some funding. So you need to have some money which you can spend on doing things in the right way. So I think it's way broader than just saying it's a cybersecurity problem, and it's really hard to tackle. And I can only warn to say, well, we just need some smart filters, and then we can solve that problem, because I don't think that's the way how it will work at the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thanks so much for the questions. Please keep the questions coming. Actually, I want to shift the topic just a tiny bit, given that we're already on media security, and tying it back to the first panel, to Pegasus, right? And there have been some revelations recently that the German government has purchased Pegasus. And I'm guessing that there are other European governments which have either been purchasing it recently or are thinking of purchasing it. Now, one of the interesting things for me right now is that when it comes to offensive spyware, it feels at least like European countries currently are mostly consumers rather than producers of it, though you can, of course, happily argue with me about it. But it also feels like being a consumer of offensive spyware gives you a bit of responsibility, right? So if, for example, the German government is purchasing Pegasus, should they, for example, be using it to put pressure on the NSO group, which created Pegasus, in order not to sell to undemocratic states, or in order to have stronger human rights protections? Do you think that the purchasing of offensive spyware by European or EU countries is just a risk domestically? Or do you think that it's also an opportunity, given the fact that like EU countries might have a chance to actually shift and transform the offensive spyware market? I'm seeing that nobody wants to take. Yes, please.
Okay, so first of all, I would say that European states are both consumers and producers, since in the last years we actually have seen quite a few industries coming from European members. And so we both have an internal market and also an export market on this, which are slightly different issues to deal with, but they are both relevant. And so what the European Union should do, of course, I think it's important that it also tries to address the international regulatory framework and not just dealing it internally. Internally, we actually have seen some changes very recently, because on September, there has been the recast of the dual-use regulation, which also deals with the cyber surveillance tools. And it has been a little bit watered down compared to what we were expecting. So I think we still need to see in detail the guidelines in order to understand what its impact will be. But for instance, one of the changes we have seen is that member states, EU member states, will have to notify other member states and the Commission of the authorization requirements. So basically, the idea is that the Commission and the dual-use coordination group will have to submit an annual and public report on this implementation. So we will have, or we should have data about the number of applications by item, the member states, the destinations, and so on. So this is quite important in terms of transparency and public accountability. We will see how this new measure will be able to break the opacity we have seen so far in this sector, even within the EU. And there are also other changes, but I think that the European Union at the moment is probably the only subject trying to link the export, to strongly link the export and sale of these tools with human rights consideration and the possibility of using these tools for internal repression, for instance. So something has been done. We will need to see how this will be actually implemented and how we'll be able to harmonize the controls within the European Union, because so far each member state had still a lot of freedom about about the implementation. So, and as I said, there was a lot of opacity about the actual data of this. So I think there is still some work to be done internally. And at the same time, we have seen like the European Parliament or the European Commission addressing the issue of spyware being used against journalists, even within the European Union. And we have seen strong wars against this type of illegal surveillance. So I would expect some form of international pressure also on extra EU subjects on this. But of course, we will have to see if this actually happens.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Sebastian, Lawrence, who wants to take the floor first?
Yes, I can. I wanted to shift the focus a bit from the actual, let's say, spyware to how you get the spyware in place. And I think that's the even more dangerous part, because in general, you need to find a vulnerability in the system used and have an exploit for it. And I think that's the more dangerous market we should observe, because if governments are paying for 0 days or exploits which are in the wild and are not fixed or known by the manufacturer of a software or device, then I think that's really dangerous if they do not try to fix the systems, but instead use it to spread spyware. And I don't see any difference in whom they are targeting, because all other systems will still have that vulnerability and will be vulnerable to exploits, and not only to those who might have a legitimate reason to do so, but also to cyber criminals and all others. So instead of purchasing software, or in particular purchasing 0 days to get the spyware in place, I think the European Union should rather try to get all systems fixed. And then, of course, you somehow have the problems that you cannot get your spyware operational, but that in theory would leave us with way more secure systems. And I think that would be more beneficial for the society than the information you might get from spying on certain criminals or terrorists, because that would also somehow protect our whole infrastructure. So I think the discussion should be more on the 0 days and the exploit market than on the software itself, because I think that is more or less exchangeable, and it's not so important whether you just buy that or you code it yourself or which version you have. I think the whole process is what, in my opinion, we need to fix.
Perfect. Sorry, I just want to triple check and clarify the whole process with you, because it's super interesting, and I want to make sure that we and our listeners are fully on the same page about it, right? So from what I understand, if, for example, let's say that you're working for an intelligence agency somewhere in Europe, right? And you, for example, find a security hole in Microsoft Windows or the iPhone or whatever, then essentially you can either pick up the phone and call Microsoft and be like, hey, this is a security hole, close it. Or you can pass this security hole on to other people within your intelligence agency and, for example, use it to, I don't know, break into the phones of criminals or foreign governments, right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to make sure, because that's such an interesting process, and essentially your argument, from what I understand, is just that we need to make sure that we have much more of a focus on actually getting in touch with companies to fix the security holes, rather than essentially keeping those security bugs to ourselves, yes?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, perfect. And Laurens, if you don't mind, you said in our prep call, you told us very interesting things also about Sky ECC being broken. And this, I think, is absolutely fascinating in the context of Pegasus as well. So maybe if you could give us a bit of background on that.
Yeah, of course, sure. Let me just dive into Sky ECC, or maybe first, let me just, one thing on Pegasus I think is interesting. I think apart from the question of sort of normative question of whether governments in Europe should be using it, in what circumstances should they be using it, etc. I think we've mentioned it both, I think, Carola, as well, as that export controls is only part of the story. And I think if you see how long it took and how troublesome it was to get something like the export controls regulation passed, and how many holes there are still in the process, it kind of shows how much Europe is grappling with this. And the point I wanted to make is that there's also political harm in not following up on these things, because Europe does, Europe, the EU especially, and in terms of its foreign diplomacy, there's a big push for what's called responsible state behavior in cyberspace. That's a discussion at the UN level, where European countries are trying to tell countries like Russia and China and others to behave. There's a big push on supply chain security and human rights in the supply chain. This is also a very hot German discussion, where people are talking about how should we consider human rights in the supply chains of products that we import. And I think that ties into the import controls. So my point is that, like, the non-action on these issues is not only dangerous to media and to journalists and to civil society, etc. It's also just harmful in terms of the international politics of European countries and its diplomatic positions in different fora. So that's something to take into account. But then on the point of Sky ECC and the follow-up, so I guess Sky ECC is a bit different from Pegasus in that it was a law enforcement operation across different countries. The Netherlands and Belgium were involved. There was a Canadian aspect to it, and so what happened is law enforcement agencies under the coordination of Europol took down, well, actually decrypted this app called Sky ECC, and so I think, for one, it showed the potential of the decryption capabilities that Europol has, and Europol has it through sort of national contributions from different European countries, but then it also has sort of its own sort of knowledge base, and they've been building this out for a couple of years. The problem is we don't really know what those capabilities are, and if you ask Europol, how does it work? What's the decryption like? Do you have 0 days? Do you purchase software for this? If you ask them the questions on how this system actually works, you don't get clear answers. At least last time I asked, which was a couple of weeks ago, I didn't get any answers, really. And so I think this comes to show that the legal framework of how governments and the EU handle these kinds of questions, there's very little transparency, and it's also very unclear what is possible and what is not. And then a second point on SkyECC was that the reason that Europol sort of and the European law enforcement and the prosecutors legitimized the decryption of these messages was that they were arguing that the platform SkyECC was aiding and abetting criminality, and so in that sense became a party in their prosecution. It's an interesting case to make for SkyECC, which was clearly sort of a very popular app among criminals. So there, I think, you know, that's how law enforcement sort of backed up that part of their case. But the question is, how far do you take that, and where do you draw the line? And can you make that same argument for a platform like Telegram or for a platform like WhatsApp, which is also used at some points for illicit or sometimes criminal activities, but you know, how much and what is legitimate and what is not legitimate, and where do you draw the line on when a platform becomes sort of, you know, criminally aiding and abetting criminals? I think that's a very tough question, and I think it's one that still has to be clarified through court procedures on this SkyECC case.
Wow, perfect. Thank you so much. That's like, it's really, really interesting. And I love how you stress at the end that, you know, there is no real criteria, right? There is like no real threshold. Will there be a point at which WhatsApp or Telegram could be seen as used primarily by criminals? And given the fact that WhatsApp, Signal, and to a certain degree Telegram have end-to-end encryption, it's pretty difficult to tell what purposes they're actually used for. Lawrence, you mentioned that there will be a couple of court cases to decide this, yes? Sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, I was on mute. Yeah, so the prosecutions are going to play out across different countries because the prosecution was held both, you know, in the Netherlands, in Belgium. It was heavily linked to the drug trafficking through the Antwerp port. So it's the Antwerp regional judiciary actually that'll be involved there. You know, there's a Canadian aspect because SkyECC was based in Canada as a legal entity. So there's different jurisdictions here, but some of these cases will play out in the Netherlands and Belgium. And you know, I heard lawyers argue about, you know, to what extent was this actually a legal operation or not, and you can see that that's the case that the defendants are going to make.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have one point which I actually would love to conclude on, which is what steps journalists can do to defend themselves against hacking, disinformation, surveillance. So I'm keeping this to the very end, not just to encourage everybody to stay to the very end of the panel, but because I think that that's a very nice thing to conclude on. Actually, one more thing in the meantime, and I see that one person is also typing question. Thank you so much to one who's typing the question right now. One more thing to conclude on is, during our preliminary conversation, kind of said that a lot of cybersecurity laws that we actually have are based on a quite outdated legal basis, right? Like you told me that a lot of it is based, for example, on prior anti-wiretapping legislation. And that therefore it's, I don't want to use the word legally messy, but that there is a bit of complexity when it comes to legal precedents, legal analogies, and things like that, right?
Yeah, so that was on the yeah. So I think it shows in different ways. I think Sebastian mentioned the element of vulnerability disclosure earlier. You can still see that, you know, vulnerability disclosure oftentimes is a voluntary policy and not a legal not a legal trajectory. And for instance, one of the complaints that we've heard from cybersecurity community is that white hat hackers or vulnerability researchers are still under legal threat for the research that they do. So this shows you that, you know, this falls within a gray zone and it hasn't been solved. This goes back to sort of more what is it? Sort of the computer abuse legislation. In the US, it's called Computer Abuse Act, I think. In Europe, it's got different forms. So that's one example where you see cybersecurity researchers at least still falling within a legal gray zone. But then the other point is that a lot of if we talk about spyware, if we talk about the rights to to do targeted decryption measures, to use vulnerabilities for that matter. A lot of that falls within legal. So if it's intelligence, it falls within the intelligence oversight regimes and laws. And if it's law enforcement, it falls within the law enforcement oversight. Both of these elements, some countries have modernized them, but a lot haven't. And for instance, the intelligence oversight, a lot of that, the legal limits to what a government can do, still go back to what's essentially the telecom security anti-wiretapping framework that we built, in the 2000s and even around the change for the millennium. So there's a lot of work to be done in terms of modernizing and updating. And again, there you can come back to the point of the export controls regulation, where you see it's so tricky, so difficult to actually get agreements on these legal frameworks to modernize them, and yet there's still so much work to be done.
If I may add on what Lawrence was just saying, I think you can see really a good example of this difference between, if you look at the traditional wiretapping compared to what spyware surveillance we have today. And I mean, it's a totally different way of collecting data and information. And of course, the spyware is a lot more invasive and able to not only to collect any data, at least in theory, but it's basically something that in theory you could also modify or tamper with the data in the device. So the problem also for European member states who are using these tools is to really to regulate them in such a way that they are able to use them without the doubt of collecting data that they shouldn't collect, or really even having problem with the chain of custody, or with the authenticity of the evidence you collected, and so on. And I think this type of work isn't finished yet from even within the European Union, and we still need to do a lot of work in order if these tools are to be used as actually they are already and since many years.
Perfect. I am afraid that we are getting close to the end, and I am also afraid / happy, because that's kind of my day job, that we're actually getting a lot of questions about what journalists can do to protect themselves, okay? So maybe we could actually spend the last 15 minutes or so, and we can of course extend it a tiny bit as well, but maybe we could spend the last 15 minutes or so just really talking about what practical advice do we actually have for journalists. I mean, based on what we've talked about for the past hour, it does feel like a scary world out there. It does feel like a, world of winged horse-like animals. It does feel like a world where governments can access encryption. It feels like a world of cybercrime. I wonder what your views are on it. I mean, I think that encrypted communication is also incredibly common nowadays, and we've made huge strides forward in this. But I'd love to actually hear, what are your views, and what's some very, very practical advice that we can end on?
So I can give it a try. I'm not sure to which degree it will really be a practical advice, but I think the first thing, and the first question on this was asking for the minimum data security measures. So I think the first thing you need to be aware of is to create somehow a threat model. So what do you want to protect yourself against? So who could be the attacker? And then you get already an idea which kind of measures you would need. I don't think right now it's really possible to protect yourself against secret services or so. They just have so many resources. This is really, really, really difficult. And if you from time to time see what Edward Snowden is saying, it's really hard to do that. So that almost sounds like a full-time job to protect your devices, and you always need to keep them with you. You cannot trust any manufacturer. There could be any bugs which can be exploited. So that's really difficult. I would say from the basic things you can do is, of course, try to encrypt as much as possible. Try to use tools which are not proprietary, so you don't need to trust one single manufacturer. If it's open source, of course, it may contain bugs and flaws also, but at least it's a chance that you can have a look and others have a look and that it's spotted. But still, I mean, in the secure shell, I think there was a bug for more than 10 years until it was spotted. So there is no absolute guarantee that anything will protect you. And I think also besides encryption, there is a question of non-repudiation. So if you start encrypting everything, there are kind of stories. If you cross a border or something, customs might have a look at your notebook and say, well, here's an encrypted device. That makes you suspicious. So either you show me what's in there, or we will somehow follow on you and try to arrest you or whatever. So that's a completely different threat than just saying I want to communicate. And that might also require, let's say, completely different software than if you just want to protect what's on your computer against, let's say your little sister or brother. And I think that's the first thing you can do. Try to get your threat model straight, and then try to see what you actually can do about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Carola, Lawrence, who wants to go first?
Happy to jump in. Yeah, I think maybe 2 points. There's a lot of good guides out there, because a lot of the advice I think we should be considering as journalists is the very the very basic ideas of password protection, of using the right platforms. I think that maybe from my personal experience, most of my work is in Brussels, and a lot of it involves some of it involves the exchange of confidential information, or at least what politicians consider confidential information. Usually, it's just untransparent information. So I think there it's quite straightforward, where you have to your basic mission is source protection. Therefore, you have to use platforms that can enable that for you. You have to be able to be reachable by sources. So therefore, I think there's an argument to be made that being on a lot of platforms is good, not only on Signal, but also on WhatsApp, even, knowing the limitations of it, and also on a number of others, just because it makes it easier for people to reach you. Then there's, your organization should be having decent policies. You should be having a password manager, etc. But I don't want to go into too many details, because there's a lot of guides out there, and I'm happy to drop a couple in the notes. I'm sure other people have others. I think one argument that I do want to make is that both when it comes to sort of our own cybersecurity as the fight against disinformation, I think it's also important for journalists to talk about this and to explain why we take these things seriously. And the reason that I say that is because a lot of, if you look at the discussion on disinformation, for instance, a lot of that is about trust in media. And the best response, or the best protection against, falling into a problem of trust in media is just to make sure that journalists abide by the ethics of the profession, make sure that they, that they protect their sources, make sure that they verify information and not just run with any piece of gossip. Make sure that they do their jobs in a proper, transparent way, that they tell the readers where they're getting their information, etc. And I think where the challenge in media has always been, it's been for the past 15 years, it's been downsizing. It's less time. It's more stress on the job, etc. I think this element is one element that's been extremely harmful to journalism, and specifically in the fight against disinformation, is that if we're not credible anymore, then that increases the problem of trust and increases the problem of disinformation. So I think our jobs is to be as credible as we can, to abide by the ethics, and to tell people why we do this, to tell people why we ask them to be quoted by name, to tell people why they should be releasing documents that they don't want to be releasing. And that's part of our job as well, I think.
Perfect, thank you. Carola?
Yeah, of course, journalists are an easy target, and I think because of the work they do, and sometimes what they need to do in order to work may be almost the opposite of security measures. So this is, I think, the problem we start from. But some of the things have been already said. Consider your threat, so your threat model, consider a few things. But I would say, to make it easy, that you basically need to think of two main things: that you need to protect yourself and you need to protect your sources. The two things are, of course, connected, but are not exactly the same. And, sometimes you may even need to protect yourself from the sources, depending on who the source is. And so I think the easiest way to say this, and being a little bit low tech, is to compartmentalize. So try to keep very confidential sources and documents and data on a different device and account, and applying very strong protection on that, and having different device and accounts for other type of activities. I would suggest to try to do this in order to at least have separate things, and because you will always need some vanilla device or account in order to check things, and when coming from all over the world, all over the sources, maybe you will be in a rush, maybe you will be traveling, so you won't be able to always apply the best measure you are supposed to. So try to minimize any harm, at least compartmentalizing data, devices, and accounts.
Perfect. If I may use my moderator's privilege to, for a second, transform myself into a speaker, because this is kind of my job as well. Like, there is a huge amount of security advice out there. And I think that the most basic advice I can probably give to people is always keep your devices up to date. Please, 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 always install security updates with the fervor that you usually reserve for catching up on Squid Game or whatever. If you are going to watch Squid Game the day when it comes out, install security updates the hour they come out, okay? And if your device is too old to receive software updates, it's probably, or it's definitely time to replace your device, unfortunately, right? But a lot of the account break-ins I see are essentially for devices which are no longer up to date. Because Sebastian kind of talked about this, right? There are security holes, and people use those security holes to break into your devices, and every software update closes those security holes. So please, 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 please always install security updates. The second thing that I can totally advise you to do is to, for every important account, always have two-factor authentication enabled, right? So that's the thing whereby you don't just use a password, but you use a second code in addition to your password. And don't use, well, SMS codes are better than nothing, but you can use codes from an app like Google Authenticator, and this will go a huge way towards boosting your security, to the degree that by now, two-factor authentication is probably much more important than good password policies. Oh, and please never repeat your passwords, because that's the last way in which people break in. I know it's hard. Writing down passwords and keeping them, in your desk at home is much better than repeating passwords, and even better is to use like an app which stores all your passwords, which is called a password manager. Anyway, I'm sorry for taking up the space at the very end, but I wanted to give some very, very practical summaries to you. I think there is one final thing, if we could do, like 15-second responses, because we are running towards the last minute. And we had this final question about journalist security, so it's relevant from, sorry, I'm scrolling up, from Justin Houston, which is, to what degree should journalists be the ones who are developing knowledge and expertise on cybersecurity? Like, do you think that it's journalists' responsibility to be secure themselves? Or do you, for example, think that it's the responsibility of technology companies, journalists, newspapers, websites that they work for? To what degree do you think a journalist should be responsible for their own security? And to what extent do you think that everyone in the ecosystem should take more responsibility for security? Because we might be putting too much of the responsibility and sometimes too much guilt on the journalists themselves. Let's do 10-second answers, and then we can all sign off and have lunch and coffee and be happy.
Just a quick answer. Of course, it's a common responsibility, but media newsroom should do something about it, not just let individuals deal with it. So I totally endorse the idea of media newsroom investing on this, and also maybe organization investing in help and tool for freelance journalists, which are a growing number, and they can't count on the resources of traditional media newsrooms. So.
Perfect, thank you. Lawrence and Sebastian, 10 seconds each.
10 seconds, that's a tough one. I think if we're, I think if we're serious about doing our jobs well, I think we should understand that it's an integral part of it. And if we're serious about understanding the context that we're in, that we're doing our jobs in right now, it's clear that it's something we all face. So yes, I think we should be heavily invested in this, and if our organizations that we work for aren't, then we should push them to do so.
Thank you. You looked really rushed, and I appreciate that. Sebastian?
Yeah, very quick answer. I think everyone is responsible, but I would say journalists are even more responsible because, as Lawrence already said, they need to take care of source protection.
Sebastian, I'm afraid we lost you there. Please refresh your window.
Oops. At least we only lost you in terms of connection, not existentially. Anyway, it feels like Sebastian has completely disappeared, which means that first I will thank Trin for organizing everything and getting together. And thank you so much to pretty much everybody who's been taking part. Thank you to Brigitte. Thank you to Trin. Thank you for the Arena for Journalism in Europe. Thank you, Carola. Thank you, Lawrence. And above all, thank you, Sebastian, who is not with us. I'm sure that he's like with us in Frankfurt. He's just not with us in spirit right now. So as a European working with Americans on an everyday basis, I very strongly believe in European values, like a long lunch. So I wish all of you a wonderful and relaxed lunch break. And thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being such an amazing audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your energy. And thank you for forcing us to explain things and forcing us to look at things in a new light. I really appreciate it. All of you are awesome. Go off, enjoy lunch, cheese, wine, all of the other nice European things.